writer and a theorist from Athens, Georgia. I've written a few different books, including The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, The Politics of Nostalgia, which is essentially a broad history of the emotion nostalgia and an exploration into how it shows up and is used in culture and politics. And then my most recent book is called Foreverism, in which it sort of, as you'll see, when you finish the book, it kind of flips the argument of the previous book on its head, and as sort of a thought experiment about nostalgia. I'm currently right now finishing up my next book, which has nothing to do with nostalgia at all, but is actually a history of exorcism and possession narratives since the Cold War, or since the post-war period through the Cold War, and what exorcism can teach us about panics about agency and free will and thought, things like that. And so a little bit of demonic possessions, some brainwashing narratives, things like that.
It feels like after that you have to do zombies then. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I've probably taken a long break after this one. Well, I decided to study nostalgia because I found it to be very relevant in my life. About 15 years ago or so, about the time that I graduated high school and entered college, it became relevant to me personally. And at the same time, it was something that I started to notice broadly in pop culture and politics, an emotion that started to show up a bit more, if you will, in political discourse and in pop culture. So it was something I was seeing outside my window and something I also was feeling within. So I was experiencing nostalgia that is experienced by numerous American students when they graduate high school, and if they choose to go to college. They experience this emotion very strongly. Many of them do. I mean, as a professor of many years, I taught several students who wanted to talk about their nostalgic feelings and what nostalgia means and whether it's okay for them to be feeling this strange, very sudden, very intense longing for their hometown, their past, in some cases, their family, their parents, and what that meant, and whether it was a sign to like leave college and go back home or push through to something else. And so I started to experience that. I started to notice it in politics and in culture. And I just wanted to know what it was about. And honestly, whether it was, as a sign, what was it pointing to? Something in the future or something I should run back to in the past?
It's as I mentioned before we started recording, the reason I wanted to talk to you was, well, a few things. One is I'd heard you interviewed elsewhere. I'd picked up the book and then, like you, just kind of kept bumping into it. I mean, I think we all are constantly bumping into nostalgia, but the idea of nostalgia as a trend, kind of mid-pandemic, there was this report that came out from Spotify about Gen Z really consuming a lot of nostalgic music. And so this was a particular interest of theirs. And simultaneously, you had, pop culture pieces being written about, my 13-year-old is wearing Nirvana concert tees and they don't know that Nirvana was a band, and they definitely don't know what happened to Kurt. And there's no... That, like, I have a memory of being in speech and debate class when we found out what happened to Kurt, right? Like that. And I was in Portland. I knew people who knew him. Like that's a connection. But like the Hot Topic t-shirt is what it has kind of been reduced to, according to some of these sorts of pieces. And I think the interesting thing to me as well is anytime we have youth culture reporting happening in trend reports for marketers, or then turned into pop culture writing, it's often about music, it's often about fashion, and it seems to be really connected to youth culture. We don't talk as much about baby boomer nostalgia unless it's in a political context, but what do you think that is about? Why do youth culture and nostalgia trends go together?
That's a complicated question, and I think there are a few elements at play here when we think about the youth and nostalgia. So, and I've written about this before, like the strange connection there. What would young people have to be nostalgic about or nostalgic for? wouldn't it make sense that the older you are and the more life you have lived, that you would have more to be nostalgic for? And the truth is that people of all ages experience this emotion, and it doesn't necessarily mean they have to have experienced a lot of life to experience it.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, nostalgia sometimes shows up when we're yearning for, even a time or a place that we've never experienced, but we can kind of imagine this utopian home, safe place, safe space in our head that we're longing for. And I don't know about you, but I remember being very, very young and having that feeling like
Mm-hmm.
elementary school age, where, what do I know? I've barely even begun life, and yet, like, daily rigors of school and pressure and social pressures, etc., suddenly you go, oh my gosh, I just really wish I could have an escape, and nostalgia can be the emotion that gives rise to those thoughts. So it's true. I mean, but again, the marketing the research might not be, what am I trying to say? There might not be enough research done on, like, the baby boomer nostalgia for the fashion of a previous decade, but there's a ton of research conducted on the youth, because the idea has been for the last 40 years or so that youth culture essentially drives capitalism. It's kind of like the foundation for the fashion industry, and for music especially. If we can hook young people on certain trends, then that's where we're going to get. That's how we're going to make money, etc. So there are a lot of elements here, and one thing I do find fascinating, though, about these marketing reports and trend reports about, which generation is nostalgic for what, is it reveals a question that, after years of writing about nostalgia, I've kind of latched onto, and I find it to be a really important one, which is, to what extent are people nostalgic for elements of the past, and to what extent are brands and corporations inviting us to be nostalgic for certain elements of the past? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an important question, because what tends to happen often in press reports and in journalistic writings on nostalgia is the public tends to get blamed a lot of the time. It's like the youth is nostalgic for Nirvana. What do they know about Nirvana? And that, but it's like, well, you're essentially selling us Nirvana t-shirts that have a certain, they're there's certain aesthetic to them, et cetera. That's very appealing, but also very, very old. It harkens back to a previous time. So that's something that I think, tends to get twisted a little bit. And the public is often blamed. And then we're made to feel a bit guilty about it. Like, I didn't even realize I was nostalgic for all this stuff. And yet you're saying that I am.
I think this is particularly the reason Adam and I started in the demo when we began it was, I have had since literally 2000 a bee in my bonnet about generational marketing, and I think it's because I was probably 23, working in my first real proper job in an ad agency and getting shown these youth reports because I was the youth, and reading them and going, parts of this are just obvious nonsense. Parts of this could be said about any cohort of people coming out of college. Like, that's life stage stuff. That's not endemic to the year 2000 or 2001 or whatever. And also in that year, kind of the first real book about millennials came out. It was called Millennials Rising, by those wonderful folks who gave us The Fourth Turning. And the book itself is kind of, again, it's very made up. And when you actually sort of dig into the history of that book, it's written by guys who work in DC and live in one of the richest zip codes in America, in McLean, Virginia, and they are talking to their teenage kids and their teenage kids' friends who go to the richest high schools in America, and like, oh, they're so optimistic and they're so trusting of institutions, and September 11th hasn't happened yet, and all of these things are true, and so they're going to be the next greatest generation, or they're going to be a huge nightmare, one or the other. We're not sure which, but we're going to write this hagiography ahead of the fact. And ever since then, it has been this relentless marketing to millennials what it means to be millennial. And as someone who's too old to be a millennial, kind of too young to be properly Gen X, and Gen X didn't really, we didn't really get sold on being Gen X. There was like a blip of about 4 years where the press cared about Gen X. They talked about it derogatorily the entire time, and then they pieced out. We didn't hear about ourselves again for 20 years. And probably was good for our emotional development in some ways and bad in others. But nevertheless, I think this project of selling a generational identity, selling nostalgia, and then going, oh, millennials are so this or that. It's like, well, you told them to be that. It was a hard sell. They needed to dress a certain way, decorate their apartments a certain way, eat a certain way, have certain kinds of experiences. These frameworks and narratives are flexible, as are the nostalgia narratives as well. But like, some things are their fault. Some things have been done to them. But like, it's a sell. And I think that is one of the more interesting things about this kind of young people being sold nostalgia. And going back to what you were saying about what do they have to be nostalgic about, I have vivid memories of being 14 or 15 and like showing up at school with, a tape recorded off of one of my parents' albums that I knew my friends hadn't heard of. Mm-hmm. And like, so you're kind of in pursuit of like what's new to you, and what's new to you might be what's very old in your parents' mind. Right. And so that's an easy point of leverage. And then we get to call it nostalgia. And one of the things you talk about in your work is this historical kind of pathologizing or medicalizing of nostalgia, certainly a kind of, we want to leverage it when it's fun, and then we kind of want to shame it when it seems shameful. And I'm curious about that dynamic as well. Like, why is it something that we're simultaneously selling as hard as we can and also shaming people over?
Yeah. I had this this thought when the Hours of Lost Their Clock came out, because I was doing a lot of interviews at the time, and there were people tended to fall into one of two camps. It was either you've written some things negatively about nostalgia. What's so bad about nostalgia? So I like to indulge in a little bit of playing some old video games and watching old movies. What's wrong with that? And then you had people in the other camp who were like, did you say anything positive about nostalgia? Well, then you were obviously a fascist, because nostalgia is very bad, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Right. And
here's the truth of the matter. And nostalgia scholars know this, and they've written about it for a long time. And I'm late to the party. Okay. So I'm joining this crew of scholars who have been thinking about and writing about and researching this emotion for a long time. The fact of the matter is that nostalgia has always been a very threatening idea to a progress-minded society, a society that likes the idea of the future, that believes that progress and moving toward the future betters everybody, and that the civilizing process can only happen when we approach the future with clear eyes, and we mechanize and get rid of tradition and all this stuff. Okay. So this is how it's kind of always been. The emotion first is written about in 1688, and it's coined as a disease by a medical student at the time who was like 19 years old, and so it's thought of as a disease for a really long time, and over time it sort of loosens itself from its pathological like foundation. Once, doctors and physicians, et cetera, realize that this isn't really like a disease. In fact, we don't really know what it is, but it's certainly not, there isn't a part in the body where we can find where like the seat of nostalgia is. And so it's obviously not, maybe it's a mental condition. So it gets talked about a little bit in the early 20th century as like a mental, perhaps a mental health disorder. But from there, it kind of, throughout the 20th century is no longer really considered a disease. However, its negative stigma remains, okay? And so because as long as a society worships progress, any kind of force that causes people to reflect on the past, not even that, but even like miss the past and go, you know what, maybe the past was better. This progress business might be a load of bull, anything like that is going to really threaten the people who have their whole careers and their money betting on progress and riding on progress. And so that's one reason why, even though we're in a time in which it seems like people can freely indulge nostalgia, I can go on Disney Plus and I can watch a bunch of old cartoons or whatever. At the same time, though, it has a really bad reputation, and there's a reason for this too. I mean, obviously there's historical precedent here, but you and I both know that nostalgia is often employed in discourses to that have goals that might not align with things like democracy and freedom and stuff like that. So there's good reason to be suspicious of nostalgia, but this is not a the force of evil or something. It is ultimately a human emotion that just for a long time was considered to be the enemy to progress.
Well, and I want to get to foreverism in a minute. There are a couple of other steps I want to go through first, but one of the things that I think is interesting here is some of the references in the book to the way people are talking about nostalgia in a derogatory sense remind me a lot of the way grief can get talked about and loss can get talked about. And it seems like that may be the part, the yearning, the missing the past, not just like reflecting on it and going, oh, those were the days. I think that even speaking of those are the days, like All in the Family in a way operates in a very similar way, right? It's the older couple at the center of the story are nostalgic for a time before they had to be racially tolerant, tolerant of homosexuality, tolerant of women, any of those things. And the bar was merely tolerance at the time of this show. But we, the audience, knew we weren't going back. And so it was fine that they were nostalgic for it as long as they got dragged grumbling and sometimes kicking and screaming into the present and then into the future. And that the grief part of it, the actual like depth of emotional experience of nostalgia where you miss that time and want to go back and yearn for it. Is that the part that we're uncomfortable with? Is that the part that makes it radical?
I mean, I think in the same way that uncomfortable emotions tend to freak people out pretty hard. So grief is one of those emotions that breaks a lot of the rules of emotion, and in the way that it lasts a really long time. Most emotions, although intense, come and go not as quickly as a feeling would, and not as long as a mood, but a grief lasts longer than all of them, and yet is very intense, and we still consider it an emotion, but very uncomfortable feeling, a feeling that nobody wants to experience, and yet many will in their life. Anger is another one of these emotions that is oftentimes people get really confused about, because it too feels a little good to get angry, just like nostalgia feels sometimes kind of good to be nostalgic for the past, but also can be very destructive. A lot of times people say that we live in a very angry society and that we need to be less angry. So, negatively valenced emotions like anger and nostalgia, grief, etc., sadness, tend to have bad reputations simply because we just don't like to experience them. Because a lot of times doing that means that we have to, think a bit or consider a bit about why we're feeling that way, which is one of the ways that I like to think about nostalgia is not as something that we should necessarily get rid of or that we should just accept outright, but instead should think a bit about what the short and long-term consequences are of experiencing and expressing and sharing that emotion around. In some cases, nostalgia might be kind of the beacon in the present to alert you to something that was lost a long time ago that you need in the present, because for one reason or another, you don't have it anymore. And it was a good thing to have. But in many cases, nostalgia is also something that can kind of get the mental wiring a little bit twisted and make it very difficult for people to accept the present on its own terms. Or at the very least, it can be used to incite anger in people. The past was so much better because of all of these things that, might have needed to go away, like racial intolerance, not that we're racially tolerant now, let's be honest, but like a greater degree of prejudice or whatever. And so, yeah, like political candidates can certainly come along and say, you should be nostalgic for all of that, and we don't have it now, and you should be angry and vote for me, that kind of thing. And I like to think about nostalgia as being like any emotion. Sometimes it's justified to express it. Sometimes it's just not the right time for it. Is this the time for nostalgia, or is this the time for something like hope, something that's like future facing? Now might be the time for nostalgia, or now might be the time for anger. I mean, anyone who's ever gone through grief and experienced it knows that, like, when grief comes knocking at your door, you can try to not open it all you want to, but it's just going to keep doing it. Now might be the time to allow it in and feel it, and then and then kind of like maybe you could learn to live with it.
This makes me think of another kind of narrative of loss in the kind of American landscape, and that's small towns, main streets. I worked on a project earlier this year that was about building a set of buildings around or a soon-to-be refurbished transit hub in New Jersey, and drove around the area. And you can literally see sort of the bones of what was once a downtown of this small township in northern New Jersey. And now it's not a downtown at all. Like, it kind of got split in half by the train and by the highway system, and has fundamentally changed from what it once was. But in the book, you talk about non-places and nostalgia-scapes, and it made me think about this kind of, the 80s and 90s were this period of time where like everything had been turned into a strip mall, right? And so there was nostalgia for small town Main Street USA, that kind of commercial experience, frankly. And now we have nostalgia for dead malls, around the dead malls. But I also live in an odd place. I live in East Hampton, New York, where I think it is both a non-place and a nostalgia-scape. Like, there is no reason to be here most of the time. It's not fair. There are definitely people who are still, farming and doing aquaculture and kind of, centuries old industries out here, or forms of work. But then we have, millionaires' homes that they visit from time to time. And then the people who live out here, in terms of like the national average of income, are probably well over the national average, but are still barely getting by because everything is so expensive because we're so far from anything. We're 100 miles from the city. And yet preservationism is alive and well here. And so you drive down Main Street, East Hampton, and it's so cute and twee. And there's a little windmill on the green, and all the houses are still like shake shingles and salt, and like, heaven forbid anyone might change anything. Heaven forbid you're going to bring a city brand and put it in one of those shops. Now, of course, the pandemic made it so that ship sailed. It's all Jimmy Choo and Louis Vuitton and whatever now, which was inevitable. But that sense of you're simultaneously submersed in visual cues of a time gone by, and yet when you take your headphones out, all you hear is heavy trucks going up and down the road because they're going to renovate somebody's multi-million-dollar home, and the shops are all, as I say, Jimmy Choo and Manila Blahnik and whatever. Can you talk about kind of where we are in the development of these non-places and nostalgia-scapes? Like, do we just kind of keep moving on so that the mall that used to be the non-place is now a nostalgia-scape? Like, is that just sort of a recurrent thing that we'll never be free from?
Yeah, I mean, the attempts to try to, if not preserve something from history that might survive into the future or something, or to create places that look old but are new, these are attempts to try to, they speak to a sense of safety within us, and so they can be very soothing. And I think it's easy to say, like, well, the the heavily preserved small town. Like I live in the southeastern United States in the state of Georgia. So like if you drive through Georgia or even Alabama, you're going to come across some of these small towns that do look, a little like they're frozen in time a bit. In fact, we have I live in Athens, Georgia. Right down the road, about 25-30 minutes is Madison, Georgia. Madison, Georgia is that way. You drive through it and it's like very preserved, beautiful downtown square, whatever. What you find out is that there is one person who's bought about all of that, okay, and renovated it to turn it into their version of what they want a small town to be, okay? And so, what's behind a lot of that, of course, is kind of the same old-fashioned corporate branded presence that can hide itself enough to escape any kind of, to escape our vision and therefore our denigration of it. It's because, of course, we don't want to see the branded signage in a town that is meant to look old. That would pierce the illusion, So but again, that's the easy thing to say. It's like, it's just an illusion. And yet, I think we have to think about, not only why is it that these like places of nostalgia, why they might speak to people today. Obviously people might be nostalgic for the indoor mall experience. Therefore the indoor mall, the dead mall is very nostalgic. And then maybe it's the next thing that comes along that we're nostalgic for. But I think we also need to ask, like, why would a person buy a downtown and turn it into their version of a small town? Or why would be, I guess, who is it? Was it Billie Eilish who did the music video in the dead mall? Like, why would that be the decision? You know what I mean? Like, it can't just be, I don't think, that creators and corporate creators, content creators, it can't just be that they go, well, I know that people are going to bite on this, they're going to take this bait because it's I think that's what they want. There has to be some reason why, and I think that kind of gets back to my question of like, to what extent are we being invited to experience nostalgia by corporate and political elites, and why would that be the case?
Yeah, I think this is also an interesting, a recent sort of dust up in the marketing world is the rebrand of Jaguar. And I don't know if you've paid any attention to this discourse, but it's very funny because it is simultaneously this kind of fear of change, right? Most of the complaint is there was nothing wrong with the logo as it was. Now, what I find hilarious is a lot of people think that the logo as it was prior to this rebranding, that's not what the logo was. They're imagining a logo from like the late 80s, early 90s. And so the logo has changed multiple times. This logo change is certainly more dramatic, but the car designs are callbacks to the 1930s. Right. These are like original Jaguar designs that have been revamped in modern colors and, for an electric vehicle brand. And I think what's interesting there, at one point in the book, you refer to brands sometimes as being reassuring landmarks in dead zones. And when you suddenly change the landmark, it creates an even greater sense of disorientation. Like I can't find, there's a famous case study of Tropicana, probably back in like 2005 or 6, redoing their brand ID on their packaging, and their sales plummeted. And it was because when people walked into the store, they couldn't find the Tropicana. It was right there on the shelf, but it was just not recognizable. You didn't have the red striped straw and the orange any longer. And the typeface had gone from that kind of bubbly, old-timey typeface to a very slim sans serif font. And it just looked like generic brand orange juice, not Tropicana. And this kind of unmooring is interesting, and the way that brands play a role there in creating some sense of it's a landmark. You're going to go left at the Esso station, circa 1965. But those kinds of landmarks are important. But I think they also, the second that they change, people freak out. And the other thing that you were talking about, that I went to a Concerned Citizens of Montauk event once and discovered this Concerned Citizens is not the same as other concerned citizens groups, but this is the kind of conservation group. And there's two types of conservation. One is a backward looking one and one is a forward looking one. So half the group is talking about, net zero policies and getting electrification and all of this, all of this sort of ecological conservation and that. And then the other half of the group is like, I want to preserve downtown the way it looked in 1965, and I don't want anything obstructing my view of the water. And I think maybe those way offshore windmills might affect my view. The windmills they'll never be able to see. But those two places of conservation, one that is actually about trying to build a better future and one that is about trying to preserve an imagined past, you start changing any of the kind of moments where you're pivoting around that. Like if you suddenly changed the definition of what it was they were trying to conserve at all, if environmentalism just completely came out of it, if we got rid of the permitting process that allows environmental review boards and those sorts of things, I do wonder about what the disorientation would be. Would that group just completely fall apart into two separate camps? Would it be able to still find common cause? And what are the things that kind of hold hope and nostalgia together? Because I don't think that they are disentangled from each other, unless you think otherwise.
No, I don't either. And to think like a brand, it is a confusing, disorienting, cognitively dissonant way to think, because on the one hand you do have to maintain brand tradition. So I think about Coca-Cola, for example, which of all of them has probably done that the best in terms of staying true to an original typeface and logo and all of this. However, at the same time, there is a pressure in the corporate world to modernize and increase profits by any means necessary, to keep up with trends, because the idea is that the trend is going to drive engagement. And so this could be very dissonant for a brand or a branded person, to use a Naomi Klein term. So, how do I stay true to myself and the image that I, as a celebrity, for example, in a celebrity's image, how can they stay true to that and yet still keep up with modern times and present day norms and whatever, And so this is very confusing. And I think, Jaguar, of all companies, finds itself in this weird position where, they go, well, we'll make throwback cars and we'll make them like EVs. But we'll update the logo. Okay. But you're still driving in a car that looks kind of old and that's kind of cool. But ultimately because it's an EV, it's, going to survive the future or something. This is something I write about in Foreverism. I call this an example of foreverizing a product. And so if you were to preserve, let's use the automobile example. If you were to preserve an automobile, all you would do is essentially put it in a museum, maybe behind glass. You would essentially work to keep it sealed in time. You can't interact with it though, because if I were to touch it or try to drive it, suddenly it's exposed to the elements. That's not good. We want to preserve it, keep it perfect. If we were to restore an old automobile, that's a little bit different. Okay. Now I can drive the thing. I could remake it to make it look brand new, maybe even better than when it was new. And now I can go out and drive it. How fun is that? But the problem is over time, it's going to degrade again. That's just the way it is, right? To foreverize an old automobile, which is, I write about this in the book, is to not just restore it to make the old look new again, but also to future-proof it, to make it somehow able to survive that inevitable degradation. What car manufacturers have chosen to do now is to at least at a prototype level, like even Ford has done this, to recreate older models but make them EVs. So it's like we're still
the Mustang,
we're still in the future, all right.
And the Ford F-150 Lightning,
exactly. But it's going to look old and cool and all of that. What's interesting to me though is why a brand feels like they need to future-proof it, because you and I know that EVs are not environmentally, sustainable whatsoever. They still rely along the line. They rely on fossil fuels. Okay, obviously some of this is just rhetoric, but what was preventing Ford or Jaguar from just making an old car again with the gas engine 20 years ago, as opposed to the secondary market, booming or whatever, but, people buying restored Broncos and things like this, and there's answers to this, obviously, when it comes to things like pickup trucks, there's reasons why they're massive today, et cetera. But, I think that's interesting to think about in terms of, and I think that, again, a brand finds itself in this weird position where the pressure to modernize or futurize itself, is super strong. And yet it's like, they know that if they really wanted to, they could reboot an older, car type and invite the audience to say, hey, you can experience history by buying this car. And they probably would sell a lot. So this is something that's, interested me a lot is the, how do you combine future and past, or hope and nostalgia? And for a lot of, corporations, manufacturers, and brands, they're very confused about it. They're still trying to figure it out. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think this also makes me think about, to come back to kind of the media side of it, is it also feels like over the last several years, there's been a lot of, well, probably over the last, probably since the turn of this century, there has been a lot of kind of strange ambivalence about nostalgia culture. And in the book, you talked about Forrest Gump, which I have incredibly strong feelings about Forrest Gump. I hate it. And yet I loved the soundtrack. Which kind of, I think like the best thing about it was probably a nostalgic soundtrack delivery mechanism. And otherwise, I hated that movie. I walked out of the movie in the theater when it came out.
Sometimes you just need a really good soundtrack, and that's sometimes all you
need. Someone gave me, I think my parents bought the soundtrack at Costco or something and gave it to me. I was like, fine, I like the music, never watching that movie again. And so that new Zemeckis movie with Hanks and I've forgotten her name, but I'm like, absolutely not. I'm not trading in this schlocky nostalgia ever again with you. But it is this kind of, when I then turned to your book, Foreverism, I was like, oh, I kind of get this. It's like this perpetual retcon. And it's this like, we're just going to kind of keep updating the past so you never experience suffering.
Right.
And like Forrest Gump seemed to be wanting to do that. Like we could have all of the tumult of the 60s, 70s, and early and into the 80s without the suffering, because this man is just so steady and good. And of course, it is deeply suspect that he also has to have, various disabilities in order for him to be steady and good.
Right.
Like I hated that movie so very much. But then we have these more recent versions of it. And I think for me, it probably started in, I don't know, probably 2004 or so. I was working for an agency and we had Sci-Fi Channel as a client. And we did this whole kind of project. They'd already done their repositioning to be about if and imagination. And we did some pilot testing for them, as well as just some explorations of what if encompasses, like how genre fluid was that going to be. And in one phase of work, kind of the first thing I worked on with them, we had this open question about, do we need a space opera to be the Sci-Fi Channel? And if so, what's the right kind of space opera for this time? And in the end, the answer was Battlestar Galactica. And the reason for that was this still very close in to post 9/11 period, where the idea of a space opera that is a utopia, a Star Trek TNG or something like that, is not going to work. People want to know how we survive. They want to know how to deal with threats that are seen and unseen. The kind of sense of hidden threat was pervasive in the culture. And so Battlestar Galactica was the right space opera for the moment. This is not the kind of retrofuturism, I guess, that I grew up with, which was the kind of nostalgia for that 1960s vision of an optimistic future. And that then leads me to something more recent, which is For All Mankind, which is literally like, we're going to go back, roll it back to the early space program, and imagine what happens if the Soviet Union got to the moon first. And I don't know if you've watched this series, but
I haven't. Is it new?
It's the last few years. I think it kind of
Okay.
launched 2020 or 2021, early in the pandemic it came out,
Okay.
and it has rolled through kind of to present day, into a not quite present day, almost present day. So there are a lot of things that like happen sooner. You get EVs much faster. You get women in space faster because they
Mm.
need a gimmick. You have much more concern about militarization of space earlier on because now it's a different kind of race.
Mm.
The story is very interesting. There are moments where it's a little hackneyed, and they like make decisions about, like, Ted Kennedy gets to be president in this story, and other things don't happen, like, and so there's a little bit of play with the history of it, but that kind of what's interesting about it is it takes what we usually do with these kind of retro shows like Mad Men or something like it. You talk about Mad Men in the book, of like, we know what's going to happen. So we kind of live in anticipation of how are they going to react when Jack Kennedy gets killed? How are they going to react when Martin Luther King is killed? And we know it's coming. For All Mankind, we don't know what's coming exactly because it's a parallel universe. And so they're over there experiencing what happens if we don't get to the moon first, and all of the things that happen that branch off of that reality instead. And that kind of, well, now I don't know what's going to happen next, creates a kind of unease about it. It's like the familiarity is a convenient trap. It's a little bit retrobait, but then it branches off and we can't sit there in anticipation anymore because we don't know what to anticipate. They're not in our timeline. It just seems like an interesting sort of subversion of that use of nostalgia. The other one that comes to mind is when you were talking at one point about kind of nostalgia inward and backward in the book, and this kind of, unknowing the future. Like, we know how it's going to turn out. We know how it usually turns out. The sitcom format is very familiar in this way. So we kind of know, like, they can live in a timeless sort of way. We can rewatch Friends forever and know that it's kind of divorced from contemporary realities. And then you get a show called Kevin Can Fuck Himself. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it's bizarre and wonderful, but it plays with the trope of the sitcom format and the set and everything else. And so when we're in the living room and Kevin is in the scene, it's a sitcom. And when Kevin is not in the scene, it's a drama.
Right.
And like, she is in a trap of the sitcom and is trying to free herself from the trap of the sitcom where the universe revolves around this buffoon. And but like, and when we're in the sitcom, he's just a lovable rogue and everybody's doing fine. And when we're in the drama, we see this economically depressed northeastern town where, a hairdresser is selling drugs on the side in order to make a living. And everyone's kind of drunk and in jail a lot of the time. Like, the place is physically run down. The sitcom version, you never see that part. And there's something interesting about that too, that I don't know if that's part of foreverism, but it feels like it starts to tip us towards it, of like, the sitcom version is universal, perennial, forever. The high school drama always assumes that we're not doing active shooter drills and that there isn't a metal detector at the front door, and that everyone's not on their phone all the time. And like, there's it just feels like a constant kind of escape. I don't know another word for it. And some of it feels really unhealthy. And then when we occasionally have these moments of challenging the form, Kevin Can Fuck Himself got 2 seasons and no one talked about it. It was not a hit. For All Mankind is polarizing. Some people love it. Some people find it boring. And I think that's interesting, that they think the part where we don't know what's going to happen next is boring.
Right.
But there's a weird sort of play there. And it seems like media is constantly trying to figure out, should it be more Mad Men? Should it be more Forrest Gump? Should it be more For All Mankind? Should we play with the form itself and interrogate it in the Kevin Can Fuck Himself way? Like, are you seeing any other ways that media is playing with nostalgia?
Well, yeah, and
kind of challenging it. I don't even mean just like exploiting it, but like, are we actually, do we even try to challenge it, or do we just try to make money off it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it,
little both.
It depends on the entertainment company, because you know, a company like Netflix is, you know, probably less interested in playing with form. Like Kevin Can Fuck Himself is an AMC show, I think,
Yeah,
right? You know,
I think that's right. Yeah.
so AMC and FX tend to, I think, take more risks than a company like Netflix in terms of the stories that they greenlight, and the way that they approach form. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think it is common. I mean, I think the most American audiences understand that what they're engaging with when they watch Netflix's like Christmas movies they came out with this year, one of them with Lindsay Lohan, is just essentially just a little bit of wish fulfillment and like a Lifetime Hallmark, if you will, style of storytelling that I think at this point, I think it's pretty common for people to watch that knowing what they're watching is kind of stupid, you know? And I think for a long time, people were concerned that they were maybe confuse the two. But I think at this point, like there's an understanding that what's going on here is fantasy development, or just as much fantasy as what sci-fi was trying to do in the 2000s, you know? These movies are more fantastic than the space opera because they, you know, like the sitcom format, the Lifetime movie format, the Netflix, you know, movie format. What they're doing is essentially providing a fantasy of the daily life, which in some cases is perhaps even more fantastic, than those set in space. But you know, but I do think that again, it's an intentional decision making on the part of these companies. So, for example, I mentioned this example in almost every interview. I hope I'm getting it right. Hell, I could be wrong. But like, I remember reading this thing where the creator of the Powerpuff Girls, whose name I think is Craig McCracken. Again, I could be getting it wrong. This is like the 5th interview I've said this. So like, my apologies to everybody who is tracking this. And anyway, it doesn't matter what his name is. But anyway,
your subreddit will be on it. Don't worry.
Yeah, you know, the creator of a very popular American cartoon, which I believe was the Powerpuff Girls, went to Netflix with a number of pitches for new series, like 30 something, I think. Netflix declined every single one of them, but they were like, how about we do a Powerpuff Girls reboot? And the creator was like, yeah, I mean, okay, like, I guess that's what we'll do, you know? So, these like behind the scenes stories, I think, are really important for creators to disclose. I understand why they might not, because I don't, you know, it's like a creative mind whose income, you know, relies upon, you know, making these deals with these production companies, and to make that deal involves an amount of compromise. I mean, maybe not like that Netflix compromise, like no new ideas you want. Okay, well, I guess we'll do the old thing again. But I do think that it's important to have transparency about what goes on behind closed doors with Paramount and Amazon and Netflix, etc. Because otherwise the public is the one who tends to get blamed for all of the rebooting.
Yeah.
And ultimately it's like, these are decisions that are made. And so to kind of answer your question, to what extent are they willing to play with form and such? It kind of depends, and sometimes it changes within the series. Like when I first started watching, everybody told me to watch WandaVision many years ago when Disney Plus came out with it. You know, like the first few episodes are, you know, kind of experimental, very interesting, and the whole thing kind of falls off, you know. So there is a bit of a bait and switch there with some of these series. So to like experiment with nostalgic form over an entire series or a movie,
it's hard.
That's pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah. So this, I think, is a good a good transition into, do you have another 15 minutes? Let me ask you that question. Cool. Because the danger here, and I knew this as I was prepping my questions for it today, is like, I want to go page by page through the book with you because there's so much to talk about, but that would be tedious for you and also probably the audience. I think there is this other thing that has, you know, I was thinking about this morning looking at Blue Sky, and I was posting about this to no one, but the progression that has happened since the kind of big November election exodus from X into Blue Sky and other spaces is that we are recapitulating the evolution of those spaces, but we're speed running it. And so, for the first sort of 6 months that I was on Blue Sky, it felt like the very early days of Twitter where you knew very few people, but you were actually interacting with them. And then November happened, and all of a sudden, my first set of followers who I had no idea who they were, none, couldn't even figure out who they were all resistance accounts. And then it was this odd bot moment of middle-aged single dads that were not real. And then a few more resistance folks came in, and then it was cam girls. And I was like, oh, well, I know we've really made it when I'm seeing women in vinyl clothing. And then today, well, the last 2 days, it's been the fake celebrities. So the imposter accounts pretending to be Keanu Reeves or Kevin Costner or whatever. And it's like, all right, well, we're already here. we're already in dead internet. Like, this is just bots, I guess, reposting each other and pretending to follow me. And I'm going to now complain about it in a 3-post thread that no one's going to see because the algorithm is now flooded with this junk. And I think one of the things you reference is someone else, I think, had the phrase, but it was this inability to imagine the present, the acceleration of history, the overabundance of events, and yet this overabundance of events that we are all trying to give meaning in real time. And as I think I wrote in the margins of that section of the book, I was like, the overabundance of events, the feed, the meaning making, the takes. And like, this is the space that we're living in at the moment. And I wonder, it seems like in the books you talk about the 2020s as this period of kind of heightened nostalgia. 2020s, we're only halfway through. But it's like, reaction to polycrisis, a sense of relentless nowness, like not necessarily new, but now. Like Elon Musk this week is trying to overthrow the British government over something that happened in 2009 because it suddenly came to his attention. And so,
what
like,
a buffoon.
Yeah, yes, he is one of the demonstrations that we are in the worst timeline. But this kind of constant sense of like, I'm being bombarded with information. I don't know how current it is. I have to, if I'm online, I have to make some kind of meaning of it, even if it's I'm ignoring it, I'm reposting it, I'm commenting on it, I'm taking it on board as if it is true. And we have a truth default where our first reaction to most information is that it's true. Like, this kind of moment that we're in seems to be calling us to nostalgia more than other periods in our recent memory. Like in your and my lifetime, this feels like way more remember when, remember last month, remember before the election, remember before 2016, remember before the golden escalator, like all that remember when, remember, March of 2020, remember January, like those moments seem to be collapsing. The nostalgia for before could literally be nostalgia for yesterday.
Right. Yeah. I've thought about this a lot because I think it is a consequence of very fast turnover in information, like information transmission. And so plenty of people have written about this and like how hard it is to contextualize, to process. There isn't a whole lot of time to process. This is one reason why like the turnover in like memes on Instagram, for example, can be very fast. Instagram knows it's going to show me a lot of random, ridiculous memes because I've written about them before. And so it's like, here you go. So to see how a meme can get fast tracked from its, like inception to its more experimental period. I mean, it's very quick. It's a matter of a day or two. And then even like, memes that circulate widely last week are considered old news today. So, it is like the digital equivalent of like single-use plastics. It's like there's a fast turnover of this information. Then information goes somewhere, it exists somewhere in servers, Amazon Web Services, And of course, you and I know that the servers that house so much of this digital information have an economic and environmental impact,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And so it is a ton of info dumping on us all the time. One thing that I like to remind people of, and I've been in debates and I've had talks before with folks about the degree to which social media and real life, what relationship do these two things have?
Mm-hmm.
And I always like to go back to think about something like news media. So news media and social media are just two forms of media, okay? Just like
Mm-hmm.
reality TV or something like this, all right? So news media, I think that the American public knows this enough that news, maybe not everybody, but I think we have an idea that news media doesn't reflect reality completely.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not completely, all right?
Right.
Events happen, they are reported upon, but obviously framed in a certain way, okay? Now, I've got family members who take the news at its word. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, my theory isn't totally true. But I like to remind people that social media also doesn't reflect reality in the same way that news media does not reflect reality. And we could point to things like bot accounts as obvious examples of this, but also like literally the way that the business model of social media, which is to amplify algorithmically and artificially amplify certain discourses over others, typically ones that are going to or that are assumed to drive engagement. Typically, engagement is just a fancy word for like angry discourse, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what tends to get amplified, and that's what we respond to, and that's what's going to keep us scrolling through the app. That's not a public forum. And Elon Musk, who now owns X, of all people should know this since he owns it, and yet even Mark Zuckerberg doesn't seem to understand this as well, and which is quite scary. But the point is that what we're consuming when we watch the news or when we are scrolling through some platform is essentially the equivalent of watching reality TV. These are real people, but
Mm-hmm.
they're framed in a certain way to provide a narrative or an idea about the world that I think a lot of us, without the proper context, go, well, this obviously must be true. Okay. And
Right.
that creates like the perception of like endless crisis, endless problems that we should, try to take action to ameliorate, even though none of us quite know how to do that.
Right.
Profoundly dissonant and confusing. And I'll be honest, I don't exactly know what to do about it, because I think the easy thing to do, and the writer Jenny Odell and I have spoken about this before, is like the easy way out of this is to say like, well, just don't engage with the platform. But it's like, and she and I
Mm-hmm.
have talked about this. That's not always the easiest thing to do. You've got people who's, whether they're in school or they have a career that tethers them to
Mm-hmm.
feed like platforms, and so it's like they can't just
Yes.
easily put the phone down. So yeah,
Yes.
these are, I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but I do think it's important to remember that it's a funhouse mirror, or it's a prism. It doesn't
Yeah.
reveal reality.
I think this is super interesting in the context of thinking about the 2024 very strange campaign. And if we just take the kind of 107 days or whatever that Harris was running, there were some defaults that the Democratic campaign continued to resort to about thinking about media in particular. And one was, generally speaking, privileging kind of old-fashioned, in a way, media types. And so the live rallies in places that they were like, back and forth across the battlegrounds doing large scale live rallies. And if you were a diehard fan, I suppose you could watch all of those on their live feeds on Instagram or YouTube or whatever. But that would just mean that you heard the stump speech 12,000 times. There would be no news in those things. And so then the news channels don't carry them very often, unless there's a celebrity or a guest speaker or something like that that's going to be different. The other thing that I have been told that they defaulted to were, if they had a choice of places to put a story about the campaign or about Harris's policies or whatever, they would choose the newsiest place, the place that seemed like the most legit news and politics source over Oprah or something. Not Oprah. Oprah gets pride of place, but even the kind of getting them onto non-current events podcasts was tricky. And they had to make specific cases about demographics that they were trying to reach through those things. There have been a lot of stories, I don't know, probably not enough stories, to be honest, about how a particular major PAC for the Democratic Party, the Future Forward PAC, was responsible for kind of vetting and testing most of the ads that were submitted by the Democrat-affiliated smaller PACs. And if you didn't make the score cutoff, you didn't get money to run the ad. And they were doing this based on they're very excited to tell you that they used conjoint analysis for these things a lot of the time. And as a researcher, I don't care. Like, fine, you use conjoint. That's not magic. It's just an analytical tool. You could have also just done up or down concept testing. But in any event, that's a rant for another show. But the desire to like diagnose, stick to what's known, put news in the news feed, put politics in the politics feed, when we're living in this churn where you're getting politics from your favorite sports podcast and you're getting news from your favorite lifestyle streamer, and you're picking up on a little bit of both, watching your favorite guy on Twitch play Fortnite, and because like an alert popped up on his monitor and he read it to you while he was playing or whatever, like there is a disambiguation of feeds. Like it's all one feed. And to your point, like none of the feeds are true. They're just like, we're constantly sampling information as opposed to getting complete pictures. And I think about that as kind of a particular sort of nostalgic choice on the part of the Harris campaign and the Democrats to like try to act like things are how they used to be.
Right.
And that's pitted against a very different type of nostalgia that MAGA represents.
Right.
And I guess sort of a question I have is like, whose nostalgia is better? Whose nostalgia is more successful? I mean, I think we can know which one is more successful, at least for this election cycle.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this because we see this, we have seen this in American politics for a long time. But if we just want to go back to Trump, kind of like, a sea change moment, if you will, it really was like a battle of nostalgias for, in 2016, 2020, and 2024. If you look at 2020, especially, one reason why Trump lost is, I mean, there's many reasons, but at least from a marketing, sloganeering perspective, Make America Great Again doesn't work. He's been in office for 4 years. The slogan then changes to Keep America Great. That does not work because it's like obvious that even the people who supported him didn't think it was great. True. Yeah. So Trump only really works when he's a reboot. He's the ultimate reboot. He only works when he is coming back, okay, or revived in some way, which is why I do sometimes have this feeling that by the end of his tenure, his supporters are going to ultimately turn on him because the reboot aura is going to wear off, if you will. But yeah, it is a battle of nostalgias. And really what it is it's a battle of goals. What's the goal here with the nostalgia? With Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, the goal was very murky. At best, as you said, it's like a reliance on legacy media to like imply kind of like that things can be how they used to be, but still very unclear, And Trump's message has always tended to be pretty clear, nostalgically clear, that is. And it's like a very basic script of like, the present is really screwed up. We should be angry about that. The future is only going to get worse. We should be really afraid of that. It's like a 3-part emotion thing here. And the past was better. We should be nostalgic for that. And he comes along. And the really dangerous part about him is that he comes along and says, I will be the one to take us back to the past, essentially promising to foreverize that period in time that he's referring to. We'll bring it back. We'll seal it in place where white people run the world. And we'll leave it that way forever, and you'll never be nostalgic for it ever again. My name is Donald Trump, and that's what I promise. And that's honestly what his supporters bought into wholesale. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that nostalgia is always the weapon for fascism or something. But it does mean that, like, look, if the Democratic Party wants to be successful at the, at the presidential level, they're going to have to learn how to incorporate not just nostalgia, but a wide variety of effective emotions in their marketing in order to be able to succeed. Otherwise, the old anger at the present, fear of the future, nostalgia for the past script, it it tends to win. Just ask Ronald Reagan about that. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yes.
It tends to win. So it's something I've thought a lot about. It's going to come down to emotions.
Yeah. How do you think accelerationists fit into this narrative, right? The sort of sense of an inevitable decline. Let's speed it up. Let's knock out a substation. Let's try to get the government to invoke martial law. Like that seems to be how they all think it works. But
I'm probably not the best person to ask, because that ideology, or I don't know, is it a movement? It's sort of splintered, in the last decade or more. There's definitely some folks who have written on accelerationism who still write about it from like the left side of things, and see it as like okay, I understand the argument here ultimately. But it's not what these right accelerationists are saying, which is like, to speed things up just means having capitalism win once and for all. So let's do that. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, other than, the idea that anything could be sped up or slowed down, like completely, to that, the idea that either of those moves could, engender policy change that would help a lot of people. It's kind of like, it might work in the test trials, but in reality, it doesn't really work. So I don't know. Yeah. You may have to consult someone else about that, because
fair enough.
I honestly, I'm pretty rusty in that area.
How do you think we get past the past? Or not even past it, but like, one of the things I keep thinking about from your book as well is like letting loss be loss, letting things that happened have happened, as opposed to kind of revivifying them and returning to them and trying to resurrect them or foreverize them. Even you talk about in the book algorithms, the same way Mike Podorzer talks about election models, as essentially predicting the past, taking what has been for how it is, and therefore continuing to just create more of the same. And it seems like it doesn't just do that, it also mitigates against change or makes change really hard to imagine. And it seems like, the thing that I kept thinking about it while I was reading both of the first part of Foreverism and all of the Hours of a Lesser Clock is just, so how do we live with this? This is true and ever present and has been with us since time immemorial, but how do we not make it our politics? How do we not make it everything? Yeah.
I mean, I think that to predict the future is essentially to just project the past onto the future and then go, well, this is what, because the idea is, I mean, so much of human decision making is even this way. Like the psychological science about like mental schemata, like I have a schema in my head about how things are supposed to go, how people are supposed to act, and how my day is supposed to, what my job is supposed to be, like whatever. And if something diverges from that, is different from that, it doesn't match my schema, suddenly I'm confused. I'm trying to ask why. All right. So if I could adequately predict the future based off of what I have preconceived in my head, great, then I'm in control. There's a certain level of control. I reduce uncertainty and awkwardness as a result. And I just think that like that's something that, at the large scale level, when we're talking about, public policy and, things with the environment or the economy, is like, it's a nice tool to have. It's quite efficient, but it doesn't always, as you say, make room for novelty and the kinds of like, I don't know, the kinds of openings to new ideas that unpredictability can create. I don't know if we'll, in the near future, see kind of a swing back the other way, away from the reliance on algorithms and predictability, perhaps a return to a more traditional, like, seasonal aspect of trying to think about the future, as opposed to a sheer past projection model. I'm not entirely sure. I could see that happening, and it'll probably present its own problems. But, I do think that it's important to acknowledge that the past has truths to it. It has utility. And so does nostalgia. Like we can long for things that we don't have in the present that we really need to, and it may be that it's just, we need it temporarily, like training wheels on a bicycle. And then once I get used to things, I don't need it anymore. And then, I may long for a different period or what have you. But this, perpetual nostalgia, you should always long for the past. We're being invited by politicians, corporate elites, brands, we're being invited to be nostalgic subjects. We're being told you should be nostalgic all the time for this. And then we're also being told you can't go back there. So we're caught in this horrible feeling most of the time when, on the one hand, it's like the past isn't that different in some ways from the present. So the idea that like something has disappeared, like, white rich elites have lost all of this, that made them great. The idea that that is gone from the present is ludicrous. So it's not necessarily that the past is so different and in the past that it is no longer in the present, or reachable in the present. But the idea that we should all walk around with the guilt and the pain of being separated from the past, this is an invitation, just like how, Fox News and Newsmax invites viewers to be angry. Some people take the invitation. You don't have to take the invitation, though. Do you know what I mean? I don't, So I think that the question isn't necessarily how to get past the past or over the past, but what do we do in the face of like endless messaging saying that, we should be nostalgic or we should be angry? It's like a great emotional experiment.
And also, I suppose, not entirely suckering for you don't have to long for it. You can always have a constant slow drip.
Yeah, exactly.
Of a little bit of the past all the time. It's never gone. You don't have to be upset.
I mean, that is no different than what the, physicians and medical doctors of the past were trying to do with nostalgia, which was essentially to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I've taken more time than I bargained for, and I could obviously carry on talking to you about this forever. Especially, I think, as a researcher, I am coming into my one like New Year thing that seems to be actually happening is looking at a lot of our methods and the types of things that we ask people and the ways that we ask them, and actually kind of trying to identify the anachronisms, because there are a lot of things we do just because we always have. And I think this is especially true actually in political science and political psychology, is like literal diagnostic questions for things like racial anxiety or whatever. And they were written in 1965 by white men and they have no real relevance to how people are experiencing those tensions today. I mean, they have, they're connected, but they're not the same, but we're asking the question the same way. And then I think that does invite us to blame the public for responding the way that they respond to those questions. Yeah. And I just think there's a lot. I have a real chafing against prediction in general. I think I fell in love with the idea of living in a probabilistic universe and that everything's chance. And so that's cool with me. But daughter of a philosophy major.
Yeah, it's not cool with capitalism, though.
It's really not cool with capitalism.
No way.
And I think that kind of, the thing that worries me is that the more we try to predict and focus on prediction, and then we judge each other harshly when our predictions are wrong, the harder it is to get to a future anybody actually wants. And so I'm just really grateful that you had this conversation with me and that we were able to do this.
Yes, totally. Thank you for having me on. Thanks for working with my schedule. It's been a strange past few months, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.